concluded, so we move to Government Order of the Day number 1.
Telecommunications Interception Capability and Security Bill, Committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Telecommunications Interception Capacity and Security Bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker. Honourable members, the House is in committee. Kia ora tātou, no reira te whare, inga iwi, inga rio, inga hawe wha tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, te hei mōre ora. We are in committee on the Telecommunications, Interception, Capability and Security Bill. And the question before the House, honourable members, is that Part 1 stand part. And Part 1 is debate on clauses 3 through to 8.
Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I want to give a bit of an introduction to this Part 1 of the bill and to the bill in general, and where Labor stands on this, which is strongly opposed to this bill in its entirety, but certainly starting off with our reasons for opposition to Part 1. This bill, as we know, it replaces the Telecommunications Interception Capability Act of 2004. It's certainly needed, and there is justification for an updating and a modernisation of this bill. But one of the things that this bill does is it adds a new component to this Act, to this piece of legislation, and it's a clause. It's called security. This bill is problematic for numerous reasons. It's the companion bill, or the facilitating bill, of the changes that this government pushed through under the GCSB bill. That bill failed to provide enough protections for New Zealanders, for New Zealand citizens' privacy. We contend that this bill certainly reinforces that, but also fails to take into account economic issues, the costs to New Zealand companies, telecommunications companies and tech companies, and also the issues of data security and the rights of those companies in this bill. This is a very one-sided bill. It involves a major expansion of government powers over network providers through the GCSB and through providing extensive and unprecedented powers to ministers in different parts of this bill. It gives ministers extraordinary powers, in some cases without precedent in New Zealand, and we'll certainly have more to say to that as we go through the different parts of this bill. It creates broad sweeping powers. It increases the role of the GCSB overall, their role in the decisions by network providers and the information that must be provided to them. This bill, we contend, was not well drafted. And we say that in all seriousness. We say that knowing that in general much of the legislation that comes before this House has been well drafted and has a lot of thought and attention has gone into that. Our contention is that the concerns of submitters, the concerns of industry, the concerns of civil society have been ignored pretty much during the course of the bill going through Select Committee. And we think that there are serious issues in definitions, and certainly in Part 1 we are addressing that. Today we have tabled in the House a supplementary order paper which contains 10 amendments to this bill. 4 of those relate to Part 1, and we will be addressing them as we go through the discussion today. The Select Committee did make some changes to limit and clarify powers and processes, but we believe that they weren't enough. There was a last-minute supplementary order paper from the Minister, which has left many questions around what the implications of that are. There has been an inability to discuss that and seek advice on those matters in the Select Committee. There was an attempt to refer this bill back to the Select Committee yesterday, which naturally failed. But as a result, we therefore do not know what the impact of the Minister's last-minute SOP actually is. Mr. Chair, Part 1 includes the interpretation section, which several of Labour's supplementary order papers amendments relate to. I'll quickly run through what they are. They deal with, and they relate to Clause 3 in Part 1 of the bill. Firstly, deleting the definition of national security. Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Member Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The definition of national security. This is important. There were many submissions and there has been much discussion around this part of the bill because this definition of national security includes a concept called economic well-being, which is, as I said earlier, there are a number of things that are unprecedented in this bill, and this concept of economic well-being is one of them, which has not been anywhere in this bill spelt out as to how this relates to national security, what that means, what factors are taken into account when those decisions are being made, that national security is important, and how economic well-being fits in with all of that. Our remedy for this is to delete this clause altogether because it's essentially meaningless and it creates more questions than it answers. So we have put a supplementary order paper to delete that particular definition, which is on page 10 of the bill that I have, a version of the bill that I have in front of me. By removing the actual term economic well-being, if we attempted to do it that way, then it would make the actual clause redundant. So we believe that the best remedy is to actually delete the whole of that sentence altogether. The second amendment that we are proposing, Mr. Chair, is to amend the definition of a network provider. There's going to be a lot of discussion about that particular issue as we traverse this bill today because of the enormous wide definition of network provider and the potential for encompassing so many different organisations and entities in New Zealand, particularly as there are two issues there and two clauses here that we're going to amend. One is the definition of network provider, and the other is the definition of service provider. Both again create more problems than they solve in attempting to deal with the intent of this bill, and it's our contention that they must be amended because during the Select Committee process we ended up with a wider version of service provider and it's actually made the issue much more complex. In our amending of network provider, we say that the bill as it's drafted places onerous obligations on network operators and may capture many who may not be intended to do so. And this is the same with the definition of a service provider, and our contention is that we should return the clause to that was originally introduced into the Select Committee. As has been discussed in recent days, the revised definition of a service provider now applies potentially to to include anyone outside New Zealand who makes a telecommunications service available in New Zealand. So, on the one hand, you've got network operators who could potentially apply to every website operating in New Zealand that has a communication with members of the public. A service provider could capture anyone outside New Zealand who makes a telecommunications service available in New Zealand. It's our belief that this was not and should not be the intent of the bill, and therefore we say that should be amended. Finally, we are inserting a new definition of surveillance agency, which clarifies that this term only applies to New Zealand agencies. Again, the discussion in the Select Committee was very unclear on this matter. It is our fear that it was meant to be wider than that, and I'd like to hear from the Minister her view during the course of this discussion on whether that was her intention. Was it meant that the definition of surveillance agencies was to only include New Zealand-based agencies, or was it meant to be a much broader definition, Mr. Chair? We have 10 different amendments to discuss during the course of this bill. These particular 4 relate to Part 1. They're core to the whole bill because everywhere that those terms are used, they have significance. The
Honourable Member Grant Robertson.
Mr. Chair, I was momentarily distracted by some news about one of our parliamentary colleagues, Mr. Banks, which I'm sure another colleague will confirm shortly, but it seems he may have seen the light for once. Mr. Chair, I want to speak on Part 1 of this bill. As my colleague...